Hi, I'm Tom Stevenson, and welcome to Lecture 4A, Motivational Theory and Practice. This week's or today's lecture is broken up into two parts, Lecture 4A and Lecture 4B. 4A, we're going to get into some fundamentals about motivation, and 4B, we'll get into some of the different theories that are out there and compare and contrast, and it'll give you a sense of how things are looked at from a motivational perspective. There's a lot of misunderstandings, I think, about motivation out in the work world and in managers and the way managers think. So it's good to look at some of the different areas where research has been done and some of what the findings have really kind of come up with. Perhaps before we start, we'll just do a quick sort of reminder of what we talked about last class. We introduced some concepts of or from Adam Smith, the economist, probably the first modern day economist going back to the 1700s, if you will, when he kind of looked at the aspect of what they called the invisible hand, how supply and demand kind of balances itself. But we also talked about how he viewed the workforce when he kind of said that unless you are paying for extra rewards for somebody to work harder, they're going to take the most slovenly way of performing, meaning the slowest, easiest route that they can still keep their jobs and get paid. What I hope that'll come through here is that's not necessarily true, and that if you're operating from that premise alone as a business and from a management perspective, your business will probably perform mediocre at best. So it's not the only viewpoint that you want to have. And I even think Adam Smith would have had a different view. I think sometimes you write a paragraph and people take it to different extremes over time. So we also discussed consistency and expectations, and the idea that HR people get comfortable with some consistent practices. It's easier to scale as a business if you're doing things in a consistent process orientation. And people have develop certain expectations of what they think will result from consistent practices. So there's that behavioral aspect, expectations as a result of consistent work practices that go on, and it tends to benefit organizations. I did qualify that somewhat, though. The world is changing very, very fast, very, very rapidly, and in order to ensure that your business is adapting and adjusting, some things can't necessarily be done exactly consistently. But where things can be done, they should be done, because that will definitely streamline and make people able to do more of the complex items of their particular jobs. And we also discussed the balance of power and how the ebbs and flows go, usually with external environment, changes in economic conditions. So some employee that's been at a company a long time, they've developed a lot of knowledge, and with that knowledge, they are able to get things done in a hurry. They've got internal networks, they've got external networks that aren't easy to replicate, and it takes a long time to train somebody for those particular types of jobs and roles. Conversely, in a down economic time, an employer tends to have a lot more balance of power as to who stays and who goes, because when the external market is kind of slow, you can really hire people relatively easy. When the external market is really busy, it's not so easy to bring on really highly skilled new people. So there are these ebbs and flows, and we had a cautionary point that times change, and there's business cycles that businesses run through. And if you're in a boom cycle, that's great. You can usually get more from your employer, but employers' memories are long. So if all of a sudden you go into a down cycle, that employer might remember how you were during the boom cycle, and if they have choices of who stays and who goes, sometimes it might be you that goes as a result of how you interacted during that boom cycle. So to be cognizant of those things too. You can think the short game and you can think the long game, and the short game gets you bigger returns, but the long game will play better for you over the long term, at least in this kind of example. And you might want to balance that out too. Your best negotiating time is when things are going well, and so it's not that you don't negotiate during these times, it's how professional you are in that process that gets remembered. So in this session, we're going to look at some of the factors you should consider when trying to motivate others to perform specific tasks. What will be their motivators? What can tweak somebody to be more interested in something or not? And especially in part B, we'll look at that of this lecture. And what influence can a manager have? We'll also discuss some of these theories in part B that come up. These are just a few samplings of some of the more popular theories that have been discussed over the years. We'll bring in a few other ones as well, including Maslow's hierarchy of need, grit theory, Anders Ericsson's peak flow. So we'll bring in a few other theories as well in lecture 4B. So motivation and commitment. And do you think it's possible to induce commitment by persuading individuals to expend considerable effort on an activity in an absence of a clear or external reward for doing so? So this would be tying to Adam Smith and him saying that people need to have some sort of external reward to actually push themselves onto something. And so you might want to think about that for a minute. Do you think that individuals can expend considerable effort on activity in the absence of clear external reward for doing so? Think about yourselves. And an external reward would be something like monetary, pay, bonus, something along those lines. And if you're thinking about yourself, you can probably come up with examples of, where you've been motivated, where it necessarily wasn't an external reward. Just think about in school. You could be doing an assignment, it was really of interest to you, and you got really into it. And at a certain point, it went beyond whether you got an A, a B, or a C in the assignment. It was that you were clearly interested in learning more about it. So that would be intrinsic. So the answer would be, in that case, yes, it's possible. So scientists or psychologists call this insufficient justification, unable to identify a clear external rationale for exerting effort on a task. In some cases, the person may believe that they've wasted the effort if there's no external rationale. Or the person may determine that there's some higher purpose that is not readily visible, and therefore they may commit to it. So they might just see that there's a lot of opportunity with this, but they don't necessarily have clarity on what the reward would be, but they're interested enough to want to work through this. So when we say extrinsic, just think about something external to the individual. So that could be money, it could be a trip, it could be anything. It could be a letter grade on an assignment. That would be an extrinsic motivation. It doesn't have to be dollars and cents, but something that's external to them that's really prompting them to motivate themselves. And I get students all the time, and many of you are that way, that you're really extrinsically motivated. You want to have an A. You want to have an A. I had a student one time in this course came up to me at the beginning and said, I have to have an A plus in this course. I have to have an A plus in this course. Usually that's not a good sign with me that I've found over the years, because then that individual is really just looking for the grade, and sometimes they don't actually want to do the work that's involved to get it. They just feel that this A plus is so important to them, and that's a driver. This particular student, though, was actually very interested in the material and the course. He definitely did get the A plus. He worked himself upside down and backwards on the course, I remember, and I still remember his name was Eli. And but I think he had extrinsic motivation too. He was brought up a certain way, as he explained to me, but he also had intrinsic motivation. He found the subject very interesting. So definitely that can be a big motivator for short periods of time. Sometimes, though, if you're just trying to get an A or an A plus, maybe you're missing the other side of it, that you've done everything that you need to do to get that A plus, but you didn't really learn the material that well, and you're not really retaining it that well, and so you're not getting the long-term benefits from it as you might if you were more intrinsically motivated for that particular item. So extrinsic motivation, such as money, comes into it. And studies that have shown that often extrinsic motivation can actually diminish performance. So how do you think that might be possible? Maybe I'll give you a minute to sort of just think about extrinsic motivation and how could that possibly diminish performance? Well, in my previous example, I said if you're all about just getting an A or an A plus, you might have come up with some very good strategies over time of how to get an A plus, and it might work for you very well, but the strategy might not be the best at you retaining the information long term. And so it might be that, yeah, you get that mark, but you kind of 3 weeks later forgot everything about the course, and it's not really helping you long term in your career or in future endeavors. Another example would be if I give you a bonus to achieve something. So as an employer, I say that if you have X amount of dollars in sales this quarter, you'll receive X amount of dollars bonus. So you know what? You focus totally in on getting those sales at the detriment to making sales that the company maybe can't keep up with, promising dates that you know aren't going to be fulfilled, but you have achieved the sales and you're going to get that bonus. So that wouldn't be great for the company. It might not be great for you long term either when the company starts seeing there's all these other issues. Sometimes the extrinsic motivation can cause people to do things that are detrimental to others working at the company so they can get things at their own benefit. So you have to be very careful about reward systems and how they're designed to ensure that they're not having negative impacts on other people's part of the business and diminishing your own performance as an example. So this ties to expectations, extrinsic rewards or bonuses that become automatic without a prescribed criteria. That's not good either. So sometimes you'll have where you get a yearly bonus, and maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, it just seems like the company gives you the same amount every year, and it's not really based on anything. You know what? In your mind, that bonus isn't really a motivator anymore for you. It's kind of part of your pay. So if every year for the last 4 years you got a $10,000 bonus, and this year we decide not to give you a bonus, you're going to think that's not fair. We call that distributive justice. Distributive justice looks at how the money is determined or how the raises are determined or promotions, and you're going to think that there's something wrong with the process. The process is known as procedural justice. So that would be problematic overall. It'd be a big demotivator for you. Inappropriate bonus systems can also cause the wrong motivation that places the business at long-term risk. So the whole financial crisis of 2008, a big part of it was misaligned bonus systems. You know, if I'm a loan officer and I'm getting bonuses on how many loans I do, guess what? I'm going to do a lot of loans. I'm going to find ways to make people qualify that shouldn't qualify. And later when they default, it's not my problem, it's the bank's problem. And so I get my bonuses. The bank gets all these mortgages. It looks good in the short term, but in the long term, it could actually sink that particular financial institution. In the US, one of the large banks also had bonus incentives for bank employees who were able to get patrons to open up more accounts. If they have more accounts, then they can charge more fees, and then the bank can have a lot more positive revenue coming in based on the number of accounts. So you know what? there was a lot of pressure on bank employees to get more accounts. So it ended up that some of these bank employees were opening up accounts for people that were no longer alive, and opening up accounts without people, some of the patrons, even knowing that they had these extra accounts. So it became a big, big problem for the bank. They had to pay billions of dollars in fines, regulatory fines, etc. So you have to be careful. If you have an inappropriate bonus system, it can cause the wrong kind of motivation. It can be a very negative thing. But by and large, you definitely, and there's people that are watching this, and it may be you, that, well, I don't know what he's talking about. When somebody offers me a bonus, I'm driven, I work harder, and I go after it. And I'm not saying that's not the case, but sometimes, or very often, it's a short-term drive. And once you've achieved that, you lose all your momentum on it, right? So you've achieved that goal. Well, I don't need to make extra sales beyond that, because once I hit this is what gets me the bonus. I'm not going to get anything for going beyond that. You may even delay sales because I want to put it into the next year's sales account. I remember when I wrote my first textbook, and it was with Nelson Publishing, Thompson Nelson Publishing at the time. And the person that I was signing the contract with, it was just between Christmas and New Year's. We'd settled everything, and I said, okay, that's fine. Why don't we on January 4th, we'll meet up, and then we can sign it all off. He goes, no, I've got to get it signed right now. And I was up in Collingwood at the time, and I said, well, I'm up in Collingwood for the holidays. And he said, I'll drive up. And I thought, you're going to drive all the way up to Collingwood? It's the holidays and everything just to get this thing signed? And later I figured out, well, he had a bonus by the end of the year. If he signed on a new author, it was a bonus for him for having gotten all this work done. So he didn't want it put into the following year. He needed it in that year. So just how these things tend to work. But on a bigger scale, that could potentially cause some problems. So short-term goals, this quote here, short-term goals fixated on extrinsic reward may lead employees to focus myopically on the near term, potentially losing sight of negative long-term consequences. What seems to be irrational exuberance is ultimately a bad case of extrinsically motivated myopia. Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive, and that book is, I don't know, I do have it up here. I may recommend later, there's a TED Talk that you take a look at that he writes on motivation. I'll probably post something on that. But he wrote this book, Drive, which is all about motivation. And he's a very good research author. He doesn't do the research himself, but he basically pulled together a lot of research that was being done in the area of motivation. Drive being, what's a person's ultimate drive to get things done. And I think it was a pretty good book because it was written around the time of the financial crisis. So there was a lot after the financial crisis. So there was a lot of information going around about what was some of the causes or root causes of the financial crisis and how do we prevent this in the future. Other aspect of another quote here, goals that people set for themselves and that are devoted to attaining mastery are usually healthy. Like if you're driven to be the best in your field, it's something that you really take personally because you really want to get better at something. Those are considered intrinsic rewards, and it's an intrinsic drive that motivates you to do that. It's why you stay up till 3 a.m, as we'll talk in lecture 4B. It's why people move into a flow state when they're doing their work. Mastery usually healthy, but goals imposed by others, sales targets, quarterly returns, standardized test scores, and so on can sometimes have dangerous side effects. Standardized test scores, then you get teachers that are teaching to a test, and they're not really trying to get the best to their students. They just want the students to do well in the test, so it reflects good on their school, reflects good on them, but doesn't necessarily mean the students have learned as much as they could have learned. So, there can be problems in those areas. So intrinsic motivation, as I was saying, is really that internal drive to do better, to succeed, that path towards mastery. And what research has found is that people are more creative, they're more innovative, they're better at problem solving because they're not distracted by the carrot that's hanging out in front of them, which causes problems because you can't see the forest for the trees. So that's where that Daniel Pink TED Talk has some very good examples of some research that's been done in that area. So it really does bring those parts home. And frequently timed reviews, we'll be talking about that, where people are getting feedback and they're learning from what's been given to them and they're improving, really has a positive impact on their productivity and motivation when it's done well. And we'll spend a lot of time on the course talking about what's done well and what's not done very well very often. So that'll come through too. But intrinsic motivation, if we can hire people, number one, that are already intrinsically motivated, and that would tie to Jim Collins, get the right people on the bus that we talked about, get people that are highly intrinsically motivated. And that's a good starting point because you don't have to do anything. You just have to make sure that you direct them the right way and they take it from there. And you have to be careful that you don't do things, as we look at Hertzberg's motivation theory, which would be hygiene factors, things to demotivate somebody that's already motivated. So, and you know what? For some jobs, it may be difficult to intrinsically motivate people. Consider the following statement: I'd be happier if I did not have to work at all. What percentage of people do you think agreed with that statement? There's a lot of people that really aren't too thrilled with their jobs. But you'd be surprised. 76% disagreed with the statement. 72% said they would continue to work even if they were financially comfortable. And 58% said they would place a lot of extra mental effort above what is required from the work, above and beyond. That's where, you're not working, but you're thinking about work. You're concerned about something. You're actually giving it thought above and beyond what you necessarily have to do. These are things that tend to tie with intrinsic motivation. And it's nice to sit on a beach for a while. It's nice to travel for a while. But at a certain point, people tend to want to have some sort of purpose. And we talked about core values, purpose, mission, vision, and all those things. People tend to be happiest when they do, even on a personal level, have a sense of purpose. It doesn't mean that you work at the same job. If you won the lottery or something like that, you'd look for something that has purpose. It becomes a problem with a lot of lottery winners because they don't. They kind of do the sort of, I'm going to relax, I'm going to, travel, I'm going to spend this money, but they really have no purpose. It's the same thing with multi-billionaires. They run into problems because at a certain point, if they've been totally extrinsically driven, they're not that happy, they're not that fulfilled. That's why you see people like Bill Gates, they spent the first half of their life really building it, and then they spend the last half of their life wanting to give it away. And he's not the first. Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, that have kind of fallen into that mold as well, because they have a much better sense of purpose. Once you buy a football team and a baseball team and you hang out with the players and that only takes you so far. But if you have some sort of purpose, it has a lot of intrinsic satisfaction. So some jobs obviously lend themselves a little bit better for that. But again, there are people that can even view a janitorial job as having purpose. If you're a janitor in a hospital, if you just view it like you're cleaning the rooms, then it's not really serving you much as other than a paycheck. But if you actually feel that you're stopping the spread of infection, you're actually helping families when you see them in the hallway and how you communicate, you can actually bring a sense of purpose into that role. And it can really help people as a whole. So that's the difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation when we think about things in those terms. And if you have a lot of employees that are very highly engaged, getting them engaged is helping to get them intrinsically motivated, then that's going to make the difference between, like I said, a mediocre organization and a great organization. It can take a company from being good to being great. So there's a couple of, as I said, we'll talk about a few theories along the way. Um, this is Frederick Taylor, and Frederick Taylor brought in the theory of principles of scientific management. And so don't confuse this as a motivation theory. It's definitely not a motivation theory. It's a productivity theory that really you can look at anything and you can deconstruct it and you can figure out better ways, faster ways, more productive ways of doing that process. And as you continuously improve it, although he wasn't the father of continuous improvement, but if you deconstruct it, you can come up with scientific ways of doing things more efficiently. So in the early 1900s, around the time Henry Ford started the assembly line, he was studying workers' productivity and breaking it down into smaller and smaller tasks and really closely looking for efficiencies. If you want, you can Google Taylorism and you will see some of the concepts, and you'll even see some of the original videos that Taylor shot watching people lay bricks, watching people move coal and different items like that to try to look at the process. What's the proper size of shovel ergonomically to use that we can maximize the amount of coal that's being moved from one place to another, or bricks that are being laid, etc. So we are obviously, when I'm mentioning this, you're probably saying, well, that's the way we do things, isn't it? And that is very much the way we do things. Although at that time period, with where the thought processes in general was and where North American manufacturing was, I would say the balance of power, there was a lot more balance of power with employers at that time than with employees. And workers' rights weren't as much as they were, and unions weren't as strong as they became. So there was a certain amount of there's always de-skilling going on. There's de-skilling going on right now with artificial intelligence. It's taking a process and trying to break it down so it can be done without humans or with less human influence on it. Well, Taylorism was the same idea. It would take something that would require a skilled craft to be able to do many skills and breaking it down so it could be divided up more efficiently. So what that involves is de-skilling, and de-skilling tends to take away craft, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about unionization and industrial revolution and the things that went on. But it wasn't really considering intrinsic rewards, this concept. So one of the things that tended to be missing was the aspect of intrinsic rewards and satisfaction at the job. There was obviously, with compensation incentives, extrinsic rewards were considered in the process, but it really didn't play out well for employees overall. So there was a certain amount of pushback. So it's almost like you see today where they're monitoring call center calls and how fast you are and that. And there was a certain amount of pushback. And even the term soldiering is really the term that's used where people don't work faster because they feel they're being watched. And if I've laid 500 blocks today, then the expectation, let's say 500 bricks today, then that's the expectation. I should never be below that. And tomorrow, if I lay 550, then the expectation is 550. And at some point, you're really overworking yourself, and that can be really detrimental. So people would hold back purposefully. Some of you may have done that where you had a summer job or something, and some of the workers said, slow down, because they didn't want you to make them look bad, and they didn't want you to set higher standards. That stuff still goes on all the time. But it's really was brought to the forefront with soldiering, and there was even strikes and protests as a result of some of the Taylorism concepts. Really, the principles replace traditional methods with scientific methods, scientifically select, train, and develop each worker rather than letting them develop on their own, because then they'll get bad habits and that sort of thing. So you're really trying to look for what's the most efficient process. Cooperate with the worker to ensure the methods developed are actually being used. That's being
really monitor them closely, and divide the work nearly equally between managers and workers so that managers apply planning of the scientific measures that ensure that the workers actually do the work scientifically. Taylorism involved, it was great for managers because he really felt you needed a lot of managers to be effective at managing employees. So a lot of these concepts were widely adopted and instituted, and really because extrinsic rewards was kind of seen to be the drivers and intrinsic rewards was just kind of fluff and silliness at that time period, the viewpoint, that's where things were taken up. So intrinsic rewards weren't really a big consideration during this time period or any time period before that. It really didn't become a consideration until the 1950s and 60s and has evolved to today. So scientific management definitely improved productivity. So there's no doubt that that has improvements in productivity, but not necessarily the extreme improvements that are possible, but from where they were, definitely. Increased monotony of the work, dehumanized the process, as I said, core job dimension of skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, ability to make your own decisions were all gone. All right, so some of those things played out in Taylorism. And while there's many problems with scientific management, as I said, it's still the way many jobs are performed today. But you could take a company like Toyota with the Toyota production system. It's taken a lot of the scientific methods, but it also has added the aspect of intrinsic value into it and trying to give workers a little bit more autonomy, that a worker could stop the assembly line if they saw something wrong. Workers can contribute to the improvement process, etc. So that's where it's been trying to meld and take advantage of both systems. And so in some sectors, this is normal. However, there needs to be consideration, as I said, like where does HR, the humanization aspect and engagement aspect fit in with this? And how can we fit it in with this without giving up on some of the advantages that it obviously plays? And Fordism tied into this process. Like I said, they were kind of around the same time period, and Ford was looking for ways to improve productivity. And if we can move the cars, instead of moving the people to the cars, move the cars to the people, that would play into it. Also, drastically increase the repetition in the work so that things repeat themselves on an ongoing basis. That's why the Model T, it kind of had this saying. It's kind of a mythical saying, so I think if you really look it up hard, it was more of a saying than it came from Ford himself. But the way it goes is Henry Ford said you can have the Model T any color you want as long as it's black. Two reasons for that. Black, it's just one color. That's all we got to have at the plant. We don't have to change paints quicker. And at that time, whatever it was in the paint, it dried faster. So that's the fastest drying paint. That means it slows production down the least, and we don't have to mix up different systems and different things. That's why Ford had such an advantage. They could lower the cost of the Model T, and they could produce millions of them at a fairly low price, but they kept them all the same. Maybe for too long, GM kind of almost took over their business, because all of a sudden then they were offering different colors and different makes and different yearly styles, and that kind of changed things. Ford had to play a little bit of catch up in later years. But Ford was very innovative at the time, had a vision that basically any worker should be able to drive and afford a car. That was a big deal for him, that their workers should be able to afford to purchase the cars. They had different buy programs. Up to that point, you had to be really wealthy to buy a car. So that changed everything in the US, and the view that they would pay very well. They paid $5 a day for 8 hours work and benefits. At that time, that was unheard of. That was a large amount of money. People lined up for blocks to try to get a job at Ford during that time period. Actually, I would recommend that you go to YouTube and you Google Fordism. Look at some of the old videos from the 1920s and 1910 to 1920s of the Rouge River plant and the workers working in those plants. And it's amazing to actually watch those processes taking place. And then I want you to also look at it, and I want you to think, but what would it have been like to work in one of those plants? And you see how the worker's doing the same thing over and over, putting wooden spokes on a wheel over and over and over again. And they were tightly watched, and they were timed how long it took them to go to the washroom, all of these things. And you start to think, it's not that great, it would be very difficult to, in today's environment, to work that kind of way. And eventually unions really became a problem for Ford. But in the early years, it was this new, exciting sort of thing, and we're going to belt the roads of the U.S. and that vision of everybody being able to drive and afford a car and drive where they wanted to on the weekends. It was really quite the vision of the time. Of course, Ford had a lot of other issues, so don't think I'm describing him as this perfect individual, because there's a lot of issues there if you look at biographies and histories. Pretty much anybody I discuss in this course, there's the fundamental pluses, but there's the minuses that go along with it. The other thing is, when you talk about innovation, if Ford didn't invent the assembly line, somebody else would have invented it within a few years of that process. So that's kind of the introduction with 4A, and what I think we'll do is I'm going to shoot another video for lecture 4B, and I'll have that uploaded as well, which will get it really into the different theories and applications and practices there. So keep that in mind, and I'd also, at the end of every lecture, I'd take a few minutes. I know if you're watching this in a recording, I take a few minutes just to sort of write down the key points that you're taking away from that video. Maybe something tweaked with you differently. Maybe it was how you think about things. Maybe you realized, oh, I'm a little bit more extrinsically motivated than intrinsically motivated. The other thing I didn't mention is people go through time periods in their life. It tends to be when you're a little bit younger, you might be a little bit more extrinsically motivated, just because you're trying to get to a higher level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And maybe when you get a little bit older, like I'm talking about Bill Gates, you want to give back a little bit more, so you're a little bit more intrinsically motivated during that time period. But take a few minutes, write down a few points of things that really resonated with you in this lecture and the next lecture and all the lectures that we do online, and that should be helpful for you to be able to better retain the information. You sit there passively, it kind of just goes in and it goes out, but you start taking a minute to pause, or pause the video at a few points, stop it, think about what's going on, reflect on it, take a few notes. It sticks a lot better. And then go back to the notes in a couple of days and reflect on it. And then that's where you start to retain the information much, much, much better. Okay, so I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon in the next lecture, and synchronously online. Bye for now.